And do you remember this? These are the notes that we wrote down for our animals lesson. Most of those notes get written down somewhere here in these 5 boxes, or what I call the 5 columns. Each of these is a column about the learning outcome number, time, the activities you're doing, the groupings you're doing, or the resources that you need to do these activities. We're going to cover each of these columns separately, but let's start right now with the activities column.
So a lesson is essentially a collection of activities, usually centered around a particular topic or text. The activity column is where you write the majority of your notes and instructions for all of the activities that make up your lesson, from the warm-up to the wrap-up and everything in between. The majority of information for those activities is written in this column, and the other 4 columns are really just highlighting specific details or instructions related to these activities. Now, one of the reasons why I like using lesson plans like this with several pages of long columns that are blank is that I'm not restricted to just one type of lesson framework. So if I want to plan a PPP lesson, I can do that. Or if I want to plan something radically different, such as a task-based lesson, then I can do that too. Having a lesson plan template like this one that's based off of long blank columns doesn't restrict me to a single type of lesson framework. And that's one of the beauties of a lesson plan template like this one.
Now we're also going to cover something that we affectionately call EAS. Now if you remember the 3 Ps, this was a simple framework, a way to plan out the activities for an entire lesson. EAS is a simple framework that you can use not to plan out an entire lesson, but to plan out the individual activities within the different sections of that lesson. And we'll be showing you how to use that EAS notation inside the activity column of the 5 columns.
So now one thing you'll notice is that we recommend organizing your notes in this column by using a notation system that we call EAS. And EAS helps us break down each of our main activities into their 3 separate parts. The explanation of the activity itself, and the summary, or you might call it the conclusion of the activity. And it can help us identify how much time I have for each of these 3 steps and what groupings I need to get my students into for these 3 steps. So let's look at all 3 of these one at a time. The first is E. E stands for the explanation of the activity. In this section, I like to write any of the instructions that I will need to give the students. If there's anything I need to say or do for my explanation, then I will include that here. It can also be really helpful to make a list of any other helpful details that are specific to this activity, such as any specific vocabulary or grammar, or in this case, sample sentences that you want the students using, and so on. And so that is E, where we write down our explanation or instructions for the activity. The next is A. A simply stands for the activity itself. Now I like to keep my A section short and to the point. If I've already thoroughly explained all of the details in my E, or explanation section, then I might simply write something like, do this activity as a class. But if there's other helpful information that I should prepare for or be thinking about during the A portion of this activity, then I can write that here as well. Such as monitor for pronunciation errors and give students help as needed. So if something's already been covered here in the E section, you don't need to repeat it again in the A section. But there might be new details you can add. One of the details that I might add is what I'm going to do as the teacher. I may not always tell my students what I'm doing while they're doing the activity, but I can in fact leave a little note here just for myself, such as this example here. While the students are doing the activity, I'm going to walk around and monitor their pronunciation or whether they need help, etc. So that is A, where we write down any additional details about the activity itself and we think about how much time and what groupings we'll need for the activity. Now that leads us finally to S. S stands for the summary or the conclusion of the activity. There are a number of different ways you might want to summarize and bring your activity to a close and get ready to transition to the next activity. So here are some ideas of what I like to do in this section. One of these ideas is to have the students report back to the rest of the class. I normally don't want to do all of the talking in the summary, so I might have some of the students share what they learned or discussed and to share it with the whole class. Another idea you can use during your summary is something known as cold calling. I like to use this technique to quickly quiz my students and check their comprehension at the end of an activity. So to do this, I'll simply ask a question to the entire class about something we just covered. And then I'll name a student who needs to answer that question, such as, is an elephant an animal, John? Or, does a giraffe have a short neck, Jessica? So those are just a few ideas that you can use for your activity's summary. But the main point here is just to sum up your activity, to bring it to a close, and to do this by finding a quick way to get your students to reflect back on what they just did in the activity, to think about it all one more time, to connect any dots that need to be connected, and to help them see what they just learned or what they just accomplished before you move on and start the next activity. Once you're comfortable creating summaries for your activities, and I find most people struggle to come up with different ideas of what to do for this S part of the activity. But once you're comfortable, the result is that your lessons will become more fluid. They'll flow nicely from one activity to the next. You won't have any abrupt transitions in your lesson where you suddenly stop one random activity and then start another random activity and nobody's too sure why any of this is connected or why it matters. So use your S as a way to create signposts in your lesson so that your students can see what it is that they're learning. Alright, so that is S, where we write down the summary or the conclusion of how we want to end the activity, to help the students see what they just learned or what they just accomplished. It might take you a little time to get used to this system if you've never used it before. But the simple beauty of using EAS is that it gives you an easy to follow framework that you can use for planning virtually any activity in your lesson. And by using EAS, you can be sure that you've thought through everything needed for you as the teacher to explain the activity before it begins, everything needed for the students to do the activity, and everything needed for you to bring the activity to a close and then smoothly transition to the next EAS activity. So here's a quick recap and some things to think about. The majority of your notes for your activities go in the activity column of the 5 columns. We want you to use the EAS notation system when writing the notes for your activities. This will help you break down each of your main activities into their 3 separate parts: the explanation of the activity itself, and the summary or the conclusion of the activity. You can also use bullet points, bold, underline, and other formatting features to keep your notes in this column well organized, easy to read, and easy to understand.